Rain lashed against the tall windows of Maria Santos's small downtown Phoenix apartment, the storm steady drumming filling the quiet space where time seemed to have stopped. Outside, the city was blurred by sheets of water, neon signs flickering in puddles on the cracked pavement below. Inside, Maria moved slowly through the living room, sorting through boxes of photographs, letters, and forgotten mementos. At 58, she had finally found the courage to downsize, part necessity, part desire to escape the ghosts that lingered in her belongings. The house she had left behind on the outskirts of the city had grown too large, too empty. The echoes of her daughter's childhood, the laughter of family dinners, and the music that had once filled its rooms seemed to haunt her now. But most of all, it was the absence of Diego that lingered. The husband who had walked out the door with his guitar and a head full of dreams one summer night in 1997 and never returned. Maria held an old band flyer in her hands, the edges curled and yellowed with age. Neon Bloom, live tonight at the Desert Strokes. She traced the bold letters, remembering the pride in Diego's eyes as he'd handed it to her that night. They had argued, not about the music, never the music, but about the bills, the long absences, the promises unkept. She had watched him drive away in the battered van, the other members of Neon Bloom waving from the windows, their laughter carried on the hot wind. That was the last time she saw him. The shrill ring of the telephone shattered the moment, startling her. The sound felt foreign in the apartment's stillness. Maria hesitated, her pulse quickening, before crossing the room and lifting the receiver. The voice on the other end was measured, professional, a tone she recognized at once as belonging to law enforcement. "Mrs. Santos, this is Detective Sarah Clark with the Phoenix Police Department. I'm calling about your husband, Diego Santos, and his band, Neon Bloom." The words settled like ice in Maria's veins. For years, she had dreamed of such a call, sometimes with hope, more often with dread. Now that it had come, she felt unsteady, unprepared. The detective's voice continued, calm but firm, cutting through the rush of memory. "A highway maintenance crew uncovered a van yesterday during flood recovery efforts outside Flagstaff. It was buried deep in a flash flood channel. We've confirmed it's the same vehicle listed in your husband's missing persons file. Mrs. Santos, we need you to come identify some belongings." The drive north blurred into a haze of rain-smeared highway and restless thoughts. The storm had moved ahead of her, leaving behind a drenched landscape of bent trees and swollen washes. The desert, normally so still, seemed restless under the heavy clouds. Maria's hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles whitened, her mind racing with fragments of conversations, of music drifting through the house, of the last bitter words exchanged before Diego's departure. The hours stretched long, but the memories stretched longer. At the Flagstaff police station, Maria felt small and out of place amid the hum of radios and the shuffle of paperwork. Detective Clark met her with quiet compassion, leading her to a plain room where a table had been set with the recovered items. A guitar pick, dulled by time and dirt, but unmistakably Diego's, the same silver charm he'd carried for luck since their college days. A crumpled set list, the ink faded but the songs familiar. And a small leather journal, warped by water, its clasp broken, pages stuck together by mud. Detective Clark spoke in a low voice, explaining what had been found. The van had been almost completely buried in silt and debris, invisible to passers-by for decades. The floodwaters of a recent storm had shifted the earth, revealing the rusted hulk. But it wasn't the discovery of the van that troubled the investigators most. It was what had been found near it. Evidence suggested the site hadn't been abandoned. Recent tire tracks marred the soft ground nearby, their pattern distinct in the drying mud. A scattering of food wrappers, too fresh to belong to the original occupants, littered the site. Someone had been there, recently enough to leave traces that the rain hadn't yet erased. Maria stared at the items, the weight of them pressing down on her. They weren't just objects, they were pieces of a life interrupted, fragments of a man who had slipped away into the shadows of the past. She imagined Diego's hands on the guitar pick, his voice calling out setlist orders during rehearsal, his thoughts recorded in that battered journal. But the question that had haunted her for so long still remained. Where had he gone and why? The storm outside had eased, but the storm within Maria raged on. She felt adrift between sorrow and hope, between the finality of loss and the uncertainty of what had truly happened all those years ago. The thought that someone might have survived, that someone might still be out there, was both a balm and a fresh wound. As she left the station, the wind tugged at her coat, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wet earth. Maria looked out toward the distant hills, the desert stretching beyond them, vast and unknowable. Somewhere out there, buried beneath years of silence and secrets, was the truth. And for the first time in a long while, Maria felt the pull to find it. The days that followed Maria's return from Flagstaff blurred into one another. The hours marked not by tasks or conversation, but by the steady hum of her thoughts. The discovery of the van of Diego's belongings had reopened old wounds she had spent years trying to mend. Sleep came fitfully, broken by vivid dreams of dusty highways, of music echoing in empty clubs, of Diego's silhouette framed against the fading desert sun. The rain had passed, leaving Phoenix washed clean, but Maria felt none of that renewal. Instead, she moved through the motions of her life like a woman caught between worlds, the world she had built in Diego's absence, and the world that now threatened to unravel with the weight of long-buried secrets. It was a Thursday afternoon when the phone rang again. The sound pierced the heavy silence of her apartment, and Maria felt her breath catch, her hand trembling slightly as she lifted the receiver. The voice that greeted her was unfamiliar at first, older, raspier, as if shaped by hardship and time. But beneath it, there was something that struck a chord, something that pulled at memories she had tucked away long ago. Tony Vega. The name alone was enough to send a rush of images through her mind. A lanky young man with quick fingers on the keyboard, laughter that filled backstage halls, a loyal friend to Diego since their school days. He had been the best man at their wedding, the godfather to their daughter. And he had vanished, just as Diego had, into that long-ago night when the band set out on tour and never returned. For a long moment, Maria stood frozen, the voice on the other end speaking words she barely registered. Words that spoke of explanations, of truths too dangerous to share over the phone. The request was simple but fraught with implication: to meet, alone, at a place where the past still lingered. The Meteor Crater Diner, an aging relic along Route 66, a place where truckers and tourists once gathered but that now sat forgotten by most, its neon sign flickering against the endless sky. Maria found herself driving there without fully understanding why, the miles slipping by beneath her tires as the desert opened up around her. The landscape felt vast and empty, the horizon a blur of heat and memory. The old road bore the weight of countless travelers, of stories told and untold. And as the sun dipped low, casting the world in amber and rose, she spotted the diner, just as she remembered it, weary, but still standing. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and old vinyl booths. The jukebox stood silent, its once bright colors dulled by time. And in the far corner, slumped over a chipped formica table, was a man who bore only the faintest resemblance to the Tony Vega she had known. His hair, once thick and dark, had thinned and turned a steel gray. His face, lined and hollowed, spoke of years spent looking over his shoulder. But his eyes, when they met hers, carried the same warmth, the same sorrow that had always been there beneath his easy charm. Maria took in the sight of him, felt the rush of questions bubble up within her, and yet she said nothing. The story was written across his weary features, in the way his hands trembled as he lifted his coffee cup, in the way his gaze shifted nervously to the windows and back again. Whatever he had endured, whatever truths he carried, they had taken their toll. And slowly, in halting phrases that pieced together like shards of glass, the story unfolded. A tale of a tour that turned from hopeful to haunted. Of nights spent glancing at rearview mirrors. Of a growing sense of dread that no amount of music or camaraderie could chase away. Diego, it seemed, had stumbled upon something dark during those final gigs. Something that turned the road from a path to stardom into a trap from which there was no escape. Maria listened, her heart heavy as the account unspooled. The crash that had ended their journey was no accident. The floodwaters had hidden the truth for decades, But the night itself had been shaped by human hands, by men determined to silence those who had seen too much. Tony spoke of the van forced from the road, of the terror of that moment, the confusion, the desperate struggle to survive, and of the terrible price paid. Marcus and Jamie, the bandmates whose names had echoed in search bulletins and missing posters, lost in the wreckage. He spoke of Diego's plan, hastily formed and heartbreakingly noble. Diego, always the protector, always the one who dreamed too big, who believed too deeply. Diego, who chose to stay behind, to draw the danger away, while urging Tony to disappear, to survive. The promise Tony made in the shadow of that wreck, to vanish and let the world believe the worst. Maria felt the ground shift beneath her as the truth settled in. The years of grieving, of raising their daughter alone, of building a life on the foundation of loss, all of it built on a story that had never been complete. Diego had lived. He had chosen to become a ghost to keep her safe, and in doing so, had left her to mourn a man who still drew breath. As Tony's tale came to an end, the diner's neon sign flickered outside the window, casting a pale red glow across the table. The weight of the revelation pressed down on them both, heavy with the burden of all that had been lost. Years, trust, the chance for a different path. Maria stared out at the darkening desert, her mind filled with the image of Diego out there somewhere, alive but hidden, caught in a web of choices made long ago. And in that moment, she understood what came next. The past had called her back, and she could not look away. The desert stretched endlessly before Maria as she followed Tony's battered pickup down a series of unmarked roads, the landscape growing wilder, more desolate with each passing mile. The highway had long since fallen away behind them, replaced by dusty tracks that wove between low hills and dry creek beds, the only markers the occasional skeletal remains of saguaro cacti and the rusting shells of abandoned vehicles left to bake beneath the unforgiving Arizona sun. The sky above burned pale and cloudless, and the air shimmered with heat, the horizon a wavering mirage that offered no answers, only questions. Dust rose in great plumes beneath the tires as the vehicles cut across the land, the wheels slipping on loose stones, the engines straining on the uneven ground. Maria kept her eyes fixed on the truck ahead, unwilling to let it out of her sight, as if by following she could somehow anchor herself in this strange new reality. Everything felt dreamlike, unreal, as though at any moment she might wake to find herself once more in her small apartment, the storm clouds of the past banished, the future as empty as it had always seemed. But this was no dream. The truth had pulled her from the safety of her routines, had set her on a course into the heart of the unknown. Diego was alive, and somewhere beyond these hills lay the answers she had long stopped searching for, buried beneath years of grief and silence. At last, the pickup slowed, its brake lights flaring in the dust, and Tony guided it between two massive boulders that framed the entrance to a shallow canyon. The walls rose steep and jagged on either side, shielding the narrow pass from view, and as Maria followed, the world seemed to close in, the roar of the wind fading to a hush. The canyon floor leveled out, revealing a hidden hollow that lay invisible from the open desert. It was there, nestled against the rock face, that she saw the compound. From a distance, it appeared little more than a scattering of shipping containers and scrap metal, arranged haphazardly like the remnants of some forgotten industrial site. But as she drew closer, she could see the order in the chaos. The containers had been modified, connected by welded corridors and reinforced with sheets of steel and concrete. Solar panels glinted atop the makeshift roofs, and antennas bristled like the quills of a wary animal. The place was alive, but wary, its inhabitants hidden from view. Maria brought her car to a halt, stepping out into the heat, the sun striking her face with brutal force. The air smelled of hot metal and dust, and beneath that, something faintly acrid, the scent of fuel and machinery. The compound was silent at first, as if weighing her presence, deciding whether to acknowledge this newcomer. Then, slowly, figures emerged from the shadows. A woman in worn jeans and mirrored sunglasses, her stance cautious but unthreatening. A man with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, his eyes watchful. A child, no more than 10, peering from behind the safety of a doorway. Tony gestured for her to follow, leading her between the containers, through corridors dimly lit by string lights powered by the sun above. The air within was cooler, the walls thick with insulation, the floors swept clean. Voices murmured behind closed doors, low and wary. This was a place of refuge, but also of fear, a sanctuary carved from necessity, built by those with nowhere else to go. At last, they stopped before a door, heavy and reinforced, its surface pockmarked with rust and dents. Tony hesitated only a moment before pushing it open, stepping aside to let Maria enter first. The room beyond was spare but orderly, the air cool and faintly scented with oil and leather. And there, seated at a small metal table beneath a single hanging bulb, was Diego. For a long moment, Maria could only stare, her mind struggling to reconcile the man before her with the image she had carried for so long. He had aged, of course. The dark hair she remembered was now streaked with silver, the lines around his eyes deeper, the set of his shoulders heavier. But those eyes, deep brown, filled with sorrow and longing, were the same. Eyes that had once held dreams of stardom, now shadowed by years of hiding, of regret. Diego rose slowly, as if unsure of his welcome, and for the first time in 26 years, they stood face to face, bound by all that had passed between them and all that still remained unspoken. The compound itself was a testament to resilience. Over the hours that followed, Maria learned its story, how it had been founded by Ruth Morrison, a former federal agent who had walked away from the system when it became clear that the system could not protect those who spoke the truth. Ruth had spent years building this place, a shelter for those who had stumbled upon secrets too dangerous to keep. Artists, journalists, whistleblowers, witnesses, they had all found their way here, each with a story, each with a reason to vanish. Diego's story had brought him here too. The money laundering network that operated in the shadows of music venues and art galleries had roots that ran deep, connections that stretched across state lines and into the halls of power. When Diego had tried to expose it, he had become a marked man. And so he had disappeared, trading his life on stage for a life in the margins, working alongside Ruth and others to gather evidence, to build a case that could not be ignored. The hours passed as Maria listened, as the sun sank low and the desert cooled, as the compound came to life with the soft glow of lights and the quiet murmur of its inhabitants. And as night fell, Maria stood beneath the vast canopy of stars, the air sharp with the scent of creosote and dust, and felt the weight of the years lift, if only a little. Diego had survived. The truth was within reach. And for the first time in a long time, the road ahead felt possible. Night had fallen fully over the Arizona desert, the land bathed in silver beneath the watchful gaze of the moon. The compound lay quiet, its makeshift structures casting long, jagged shadows across the hard-packed earth. In the distance, coyotes howled to one another, their calls lonely and haunting in the cool night air. The wind carried with it the scent of creosote and dust, rustling through the dry brush, whispering through the narrow alleys between shipping containers. Within the compound, the mood had shifted. What had once felt like a place of refuge now felt tense, fragile, as if the air itself had thickened with the weight of what was coming. People moved with purpose, their conversations hushed, their eyes wary. The stillness of the desert belied the storm that was gathering beyond its borders. Maria stood on the edge of the compound, looking out toward the dark horizon. The sky above was a sea of stars, cold and endless, the same stars she had gazed at so many nights from her apartment balcony, wondering if Diego was somewhere beneath them too. And now here she was, standing beside him once more, but not in the way she had imagined during those long years of grief. The man who had once dreamed of fame, who had once filled their home with music and laughter, stood behind her now, silent, burdened by choices that could not be undone. Back in Phoenix, the threads of the story had begun to fray in ways neither of them could control. Detective Stacy Clark, sharp-eyed and relentless, had grown suspicious. Maria's sudden change in demeanor, her evasiveness, her canceled meetings, all of it had drawn Clark's attention. The woman who had wept over the discovery of a van buried beneath the earth now seemed distant, preoccupied, as though caught in a struggle she could not share. Clark had begun to follow the trail, piecing together fragments of Maria's movements. A security camera at a gas station along Route 66 had caught her car. A diner owner remembered the woman, who had met with a man matching Tony Vega's description. And then there was the Meteor Crater Diner itself, a place that had seen its share of secrets over the years, a place where those on the run sometimes surfaced before vanishing once more. The patterns were too familiar, too troubling to ignore. As Clark worked to untangle the mystery, danger crept closer to the desert sanctuary. Word had come from one of Ruth Morrison's contacts, a quiet warning carried over a crackling radio signal. Their investigation had been compromised. Somewhere within the tangled web of law enforcement, someone had betrayed them. Information had leaked. The network they had spent years trying to expose had been warned, and now they were coming. The compound erupted into controlled chaos. What had once seemed a permanent refuge now revealed itself as a temporary haven, designed to be dismantled at a moment's notice. People packed their belongings with practiced speed, gathering what little they could carry. Vehicles, long hidden beneath camouflage nets and makeshift shelters, roared to life, their headlights cutting through the dark as they formed a caravan ready to slip away into the night. Maria watched the flurry of movement, her heart heavy with dread. The weight of the years apart from Diego, of the choices that had kept them separated, pressed down on her. And now, with the chance for truth and reunion so close, the threat of losing him again loomed large. She had found him only to face the risk of losing him forever. This time not to silence or guilt, but to the cold reach of those determined to protect their secrets at any cost. Diego stood beside her, his face lined with worry, his eyes scanning the preparations. The years in hiding had aged him, but the core of who he was remained. The man who had always felt the pull of duty, of responsibility, even when it cost him dearly. He could see the fear in Maria's eyes, the questions unspoken, and he felt, too keenly, the cost of the choices he now had to make. Within the heart of the compound, Ruth coordinated the evacuation, her voice steady, her commands clear. She had done this before. She had seen the cost of hesitation. The network they fought was ruthless, and now it was moving against them with all its force. The window for escape was closing fast. Diego's decision came as the desert wind kicked up, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. He could not run anymore. The years of hiding, of watching his daughter's milestones from afar, of hearing about his grandchildren secondhand, it had been a prison of his own making. And now, with the chance to set things right, he could not turn his back on it. Maria felt the shift in him, sensed the resolve as he looked toward the horizon, where the glow of distant city lights marked the way back to the life they had both lost. He would return. He would face the truth, the consequences, whatever they might be. And he would do it not just for himself, but for her, for their daughter, for the grandchildren he had never held. The charade had gone on long enough. The first vehicles began to pull away, their tires crunching on gravel, their red taillights disappearing into the dark. Diego and Maria stood together in the silence that followed, the weight of the moment settling between them. There was no turning back. The reckoning had come. And as the compound emptied, as the last of the evacuees slipped away into the night, they turned toward Phoenix, toward the truth that awaited, knowing that the path ahead would demand everything they had left to give. The road back to Phoenix stretched long and empty beneath the pale light of dawn. The desert, which had felt vast and sheltering in the night, now seemed exposed, raw beneath the waking sky. Diego and Maria drove in silence, the hum of the tires on the cracked asphalt the only sound between them. Every mile brought them closer to the city they once called home, closer to the life they had abandoned and the reckoning that awaited them there. Maria's thoughts raced as the sun crept higher, washing the landscape in gold and pink. The relief of having Diego beside her was tempered by dread. They were leaving behind the fragile safety of the compound, stepping into a world that might not forgive, that might not understand. She thought of their daughter, Sophia, grown now, a woman with a life built on the foundation of absence. How would she react to the return of a father who had chosen distance over danger? Maria didn't know. The answers waited in Phoenix, along with the consequences of their choices. The city emerged slowly on the horizon, a sprawl of concrete and glass against the blue of the sky. The morning traffic had begun, the rhythm of ordinary lives resuming, unaware of the storm that trailed this returning family. Diego's fingers tightened on the steering wheel as they passed familiar landmarks. The gas station where he and Maria had once stopped for late-night snacks, the school Sofia had attended, the park where music had once flowed from his guitar as easily as breath. The memories came unbidden, bittersweet reminders of a life interrupted. When they reached Maria's apartment, the building seemed unchanged, but the weight of what lay inside felt different now. The small space that had been her refuge had become the stage for the next chapter of their ordeal. As Diego turned off the engine, the quiet was heavy, thick with anticipation. Neither moved at first. The journey was done, but the real challenge was just beginning. Inside the apartment, the familiar scent of coffee and old books greeted them, mingling with the faint aroma of the rain that had fallen days before. But something else lingered, a tension, a sense of being watched. Maria felt it before she saw the figure seated in the corner of the living room. Detective Stacy Clark. She had been waiting. Clark's expression was unreadable as she rose, her sharp gaze taking in the scene before her. The man long presumed dead, standing beside the woman who had been his widow in all but name. The silence stretched, heavy with unspoken questions, before Diego stepped forward, his posture weary but resolute. He knew what had to be done. The hours that followed unfolded in measured, deliberate steps. In the small kitchen, turned impromptu meeting room, Diego laid out everything he had gathered over the long years in hiding. Folders thick with photographs, handwritten notes, copies of financial records smuggled out of clubs, and galleries that masked the flow of dirty money. Recordings, scratchy and imperfect, of conversations that spoke in code of laundering schemes, of bribes, of threats. Names, dates, transactions, all the pieces of a puzzle assembled at great personal cost. Detective Clark listened, her skepticism giving way to grim understanding as the scope of the story revealed itself. The missing musicians, the lost years, the silent sacrifices, none of it had been in vain. The evidence was overwhelming, enough to trigger immediate action. Calls were made. Agents were dispatched. The machinery of justice, slow to start, began to turn at last. But the truth, as powerful as it was, did not come without danger. As night fell over the city, casting long shadows between the towers of downtown, the past came calling one final time. The phone rang, sharp and jarring in the stillness of the apartment. Maria answered, and the voice that greeted her was low, gravelly, edged with menace. A voice that spoke not of justice, but of revenge. The words were few, but their meaning was clear. Diego's defiance had cost powerful men a fortune. The debt was overdue, and now the price would be paid not by Diego alone, but by those he loved. The caller spoke of Sofia by name, of grandchildren Maria had barely begun to describe to Diego, of lives that could be snuffed out as easily as candles in the dark. Maria's hands shook as she replaced the receiver. The threat hung in the room like smoke, choking away the fragile sense of victory that had begun to bloom. Diego's shoulders sagged beneath the weight of it. He had returned to face the truth, to make amends, but the danger had followed him home. Before dawn, federal marshals arrived, their presence quiet but commanding. Plans were laid swiftly, efficiently. Maria and her family would be moved, hidden under the protection of the law. Diego, too, would vanish again, not in shame, not in guilt, but as a key witness in a case that would shake the foundations of the criminal network he had helped expose. The apartment, once a place of solitude, became a staging ground for survival. As the first light of day touched the city, casting the towers of downtown in rose and gold, the wheels of justice turned in earnest. Raids swept through the Southwest, doors broken open, records seized, suspects taken into custody. The network that had operated in the shadows for decades found itself dragged into the light. But for Diego and Maria, there was no triumph in the morning sun, only the knowledge that the fight was not yet over. The truth had been revealed, but at a cost they had yet to fully reckon with. As they left the apartment behind, escorted by the silent guardians of the law, they carried with them the hope that the next chapter would bring not just safety, but peace. 6 months passed beneath the vast, unyielding skies of the Southwest. Months during which the desert seemed to hold its breath as the storm of justice swept across the region. The network that had once seemed untouchable, woven deep into the fabric of clubs, galleries, and shops along forgotten highways, crumbled beneath the weight of the truth Diego Santos had helped to deliver. Courtrooms echoed with testimony, with evidence so damning it left no room for doubt. One by one, the faces behind the facade of respectability fell. The club owners, the brokers, the middlemen who had moved fortunes under the guise of art and music, all unmasked, all brought to account. Maria watched the news unfold from safe houses and hotel rooms, each broadcast a reminder of how deeply the past had rooted itself in the present. 15 convictions. Charges ranging from money laundering to racketeering, conspiracy to commit fraud, even murder. The empire that had stolen so much from so many had been dismantled piece by piece. The final blow delivered not by federal agents, but by a musician who had once only dreamed of filling concert halls, not court dockets. When it was over, when the last sentence had been handed down and the last news van had packed up and driven away, Diego stood in the courthouse doorway, the afternoon sun warm on his face. For the first time in 26 years, he was free. Free of the shadows that had dogged his every step, of the guilt that had kept him apart from the ones he loved, of the weight of secrets too dangerous to speak. The federal prosecutor had kept his promise, recommending immunity in exchange for Diego's cooperation. And so, the man who had vanished into the night so long ago walked out into the light once more, changed but unbroken. Maria stood nearby, watching him. The man before her was both familiar and unfamiliar. The young musician who had once filled their home with song had been tempered by time and hardship. His face was lined, his hair silvered, but in his eyes burned the same determination, the same fire that had once made her fall in love. They had lost so much, years that could never be reclaimed, moments that would remain only in memory. But now, at least, they could begin again. Waiting outside the courthouse was Sofia, their daughter, no longer the child Diego remembered, but a woman grown strong in his absence. Beside her stood her own children, grandchildren Diego had never met, had only imagined on lonely nights beneath unfamiliar stars. The reunion was awkward at first, tentative, as if they were all feeling their way across the chasm of the years. But as tears blurred the lines between past and present, as arms finally wrapped around one another in long-denied embraces, the healing began. In the weeks that followed, Diego moved quietly through the rhythms of normal life, relearning the simple pleasures he had once taken for granted. He helped Maria in the garden behind her apartment, feeling the warm soil between his fingers. He walked with Sofia and her children in the park, watching as the younger ones laughed and chased one another beneath the trees. Each small moment was a gift, precious for its ordinariness, a reminder of all he had nearly lost. But the question lingered, unspoken at first, then finally voiced. Would he stay? Could he, after so many years of running, of hiding, of living at the edges of the world, find a place in this one again? Maria wondered and feared the answer, even as she hoped for it. The man she loved had returned, but would he remain? Or would the weight of the past pull him away once more? Diego, for his part, felt the tug of old habits, the urge to retreat, to keep moving, to avoid the complications of rebuilding what had been broken. But something had changed. The years of isolation had taught him the cost of absence. He saw it in the lines on Maria's face, in the guarded warmth of Sofia's smile, in the curiosity of his grandchildren as they studied this stranger who shared their blood. And he knew, deep down, that he could not leave again. The price had already been too high. Tony Vega, who had also stepped from the shadows to testify, made a different choice. The desert, once a place of refuge, had become a landscape of memories too painful to bear. With the trials over and his part played, he packed what little he had and left Arizona behind, seeking peace in places where the past could not find him. But before he left, he gave Diego a gift, a song, written during long nights in hiding, a melody of hope and redemption, of second chances and the courage to come home. On a warm evening, with the sky painted in shades of gold and rose, Diego found himself alone in Maria's small living room. The guitar he had once loved, its strings now worn and its wood scarred by time, rested in his hands. His fingers moved over it tentatively at first, the calluses of a musician's life long faded, the muscles stiff with disuse. But as the first notes rang out, halting and soft, something stirred within him. The music was still there, waiting beneath the silence, waiting for him to remember. Maria watched from the kitchen, her heart full as the strains of the new song filled the room. It was not polished, not perfect, but it was real, and it was theirs. The young man who had serenaded her beneath the stars, who had dreamed of reaching hearts with his music, had come full circle. The dream had been battered, but not broken. Neon Bloom, it seemed, was ready to rise again. And as night fell over the city, as the last light faded from the sky, the music carried out through the open window, mingling with the evening breeze, a song of return, of forgiveness, of the promise that some journeys, no matter how long, can still find their way home.